everyone, I'm Calluna, and welcome back to another episode of Screenshots. So, remember last year when the Netflix version of Death Note came out? Yeah, everyone was pretty sure it was going to be a bad movie, not just a bad adaptation of the original manga. But I wanted to give it the benefit of the doubt, so I watched it. It is not good. It is kinda like a Cliff Notes version of the story, with a bunch of Final Destination-like deaths, and a whole bunch of mixed-up personalities. It's a mess. So it got me thinking about the previous adaptations that came before it. Of course, the anime is really good since it sticks pretty close to the manga and has the luxury of doing so, being a TV series versus a movie with a 2-hour runtime limit. I watched the 2006 films around the time they came out, and while they're kinda goofy and over the top at times, there are parts of it I really enjoyed, and was surprised when it managed to stick closer to the manga than the anime did in some instances. As a result, I looked through the various adaptations of Death Note and found that no one version sticks absolutely solidly to the original story. Discounting normal adaptation features like merging characters together, shortening the timeline, or only focusing on the section of Light versus L, I was fascinated by the small changes being made in each version, and how it slightly changes our perspective of the characters. So I'm going to be focusing on the following adaptations: the original manga, the anime series, the Nippon television films, the first two, the TV drama series, and the Netflix movie. The purpose of this video is to discuss the variations on certain key moments in the Death Note franchise, how they are changed or adapted in each one, and how those changes subsequently affect how we view the characters and the story. There are 4 pivotal moments in Death Note that I will be discussing, that each of these adaptations changes in some way. These 4 moments play a huge role in how effective each version is in staying true to the themes of the original manga. Even if they are changed or adjusted to fit the medium, if it stays true to the original themes, then they are all the better. Here's what I'll be discussing. Number 1. Setting up Light Yagami. Number 2. What causes Light to use the Death Note? Number 3. When is it clear that Light is beyond redemption? Number 4. What happens to Light at the end of the story? I am focusing primarily on the character of Light because, honestly, if you don't get this character right, then the rest of the story really won't work. Perhaps at a later date I will do a separate video covering the rest of the cast, so if that is something you would like to see, comment below. Alright, let's get started. Of course, this will contain spoilers for all of the Death Note series I will be covering, so you have been warned. Number 1. Setting up Light Yagami. The original manga starts with a split page, showing Ryuk bored in the Shinigami world, and Light bored in his class in the human world. The way that their dialogue is laid out, with Ryuk saying, "Same old thing, day after day, what a bore," seamlessly flowing into Light's script, "This world is a rotten mess," shows how both characters feel the same about each of their respective worlds. Looking at just Light's scene, all we see is a typical high school student in class, without really anything to show us why he believes the world is rotten. But by placing it with Ryuk's panel above it, a literal decaying world, we are getting a visual of how Light views the world. The manga is more subtle overall in setting up Light's distaste for the world, since besides this opening page, the next time we cut to Light is when he sees the notebook and goes to pick it up. He goes to investigate it, reads some of the rules, and though he deems it a prank, takes it home with him, presumably to kill time. It time skips to 5 days later, with Ryuk showing up, impressed with the number of names written. Light admits that the notebook has a power that makes anybody want to try using it, at least once. And we go back to the first time he uses the notebook, showing his thought processes of picking a potential person to kill and choosing a criminal holding children hostage being shown on the news. This base setup presented in the manga doesn't give us a ton of details about Light's personality or view of the world before acquiring the notebook. There are inferences here and there, but nothing aside from the initial, "this world is a rotten mess," gives you much indication about Light's views on justice, the law, or criminals in general. And with Light's confession that the book tempts him into using it, it lends a lot of credence to the idea that the Death Note changes and corrupts people. We see this change most clearly when he temporarily loses his memories of being Kira. Light acts like a good, decent person, working well with L to try and figure out who Kira could be. Light also refuses to take advantage of Misa, something he's been doing with Misa from the start. We see just how absolutely the power of the Death Note corrupts the user. However, this comes in a good chunk of the way through the story, Rumor has it that the writer did this to show that Light was in fact a good dude before finding the notebook, since it's almost immediately that we see him find it. Each adaptation, even the mostly faithful anime, adjusts the amount we know about Light before he receives the Death Note at the beginning of the story. The anime adds additional atmosphere to the scene you don't get with reading the manga. We hear almost angelic but creepy choir music in both the Shinigami world and the human world, already setting the tone for us. Light is listening to a lecture from his teacher, the first line we can hear being, "Listen for the voice of God, then follow it, and know that in time you will find your salvation." A bit on the nose, yeah. The next few shots show that Light follows a routine. Going to school, being bored, hearing news stories about homicides, murders, arrests, and other criminal news stories. Day in, day out, the same news on permanent repeat. Cut to Ryuk in the Shinigami world, bored himself. As each of them say, "This world is rotten." After this is when he sees the notebook falling, and one last added change is that he puts the book down at first, but then ends up taking it with him after contemplating it. While mostly the same, there's a bit going on here that slightly changes our viewpoint. The little bit more that we see of Light here doesn't really show a lot of the innocence that we see in memory loss Light later. Light is very jaded by the world around him, but doesn't have the means to change it until he comes across the notebook. Although the anime is trying to bring in a little more depth with Light here, I think it would have worked without it being included. It makes the memory loss scene even more contrasting to what we've come to know. The Light in this opening sequence, yeah, I can definitely see how this guy becomes Kira. Overall, though, this small change doesn't completely change the story for me. It's just providing more obvious foreshadowing to Light using the Death Note, and viewing himself as a god leading people to salvation. Next is the 2006 Japanese live-action movie. The movie sets up Kira's killings at the beginning of the story, and we see Light using the Death Note to kill off a criminal who has taken hostages while watching the broadcast in Shibuya. Afterwards, we cut to Light Yagami talking with his girlfriend Shiori on whether or not Kira is just. Light recounts how he agrees with Kira because not too long ago he hacked into the police database. You know, for kicks! And he finds that a disturbing amount of criminals are going free and not being punished by the law for their crimes due to legal loopholes. He tries to confront one murderer who got out on an insanity plea, only he can't do anything to him. We see him throw away a book of laws, showing his frustration and how he can't do anything to stop this obviously evil person. The guy gloats that he got away with murder. It is after these events that he ends up finding the Death Note. Here, we begin to see a common change made to Light's beginnings, making him more sympathetic as a protagonist before becoming Kira. While the manga and anime show Light's jaded attitude toward being unable to stop crimes more as boredom or reluctant acceptance of that's the way the world is, here we see a much more emotionally frustrated version of Light. We see his motivations more clearly here, so when he gets the Death Note, it's pretty easy to see what he's gonna do with it. Light using the Death Note to kill those the law can't becomes his mantra and how he justifies using it. The 2015 TV drama also shows a vulnerable side to Light before he gets the notebook. We see him and his friend Kamoda attending Misa's Idol concert, and later going to work at a restaurant. He's presented as much more normal and average at the start rather than a genius. He gets decent grades but doesn't apply himself, and doesn't appear to have any strong ambitions. He and his best friend are being harassed and threatened by a former classmate, Sakota, who is out of prison. Light tries to stand up for his friend, but the guy pulls a knife on him and steals his cell phone, demanding a huge amount of money by the next day. This whole sequence, like the 2006 film version, is showing how powerless Light is without the Death Note. He wants to do the right thing, but is unable to do so. Light is presented as more of an average Joe. Anyone, if given the power of the Death Note, will fall to its temptation. Then there's the Netflix version. This takes a lot of the same cues from the TV drama in how Light is adjusted, but even more so. He tries to stand up for a kid getting bullied, only to get knocked out by the bully and found by a teacher, who reports him to the principal when she sees that Light has been copying his homework for 15 other students. The principal chews him out, saying that just because Light's mom died doesn't mean he gets to get away with his behavior, and is given detention. So what we get here is that Light is smart but not applying himself, he's very analytically smart but very dumb when it comes to confronting bullies, and he really has it out for those who he feels are abusing their authority. Though since Mia told the teacher that Light hit his head on a beam, the principal not caring about the injury is a little more forgivable. Like the previous two adaptations, Light's characterization is being shifted away from reluctance to act since nothing ever changes, to feeling powerless and frustrated until the convenient Death Note makes its appearance. This type of change in and of itself does not make the other versions bad, however. The 2006 live-action film's characterization of Light in the beginning of the film works in its favor when considering later events in the movie, which I will discuss further. However, decisions that are made in changing Light's characterization do set up a potential problem to solve later on that not all versions manage to fix. Number 2. What causes Light to use the Death Note? In the manga, even though Light thinks the book is a prank, he's very methodical and thinks about the consequences on the off chance it might be real. When considering who he could kill if he's going to murder someone, he thinks it should be someone who deserves to die. Someone with no relation to him at all, and there needs to be a way to know if they died right away. He turns on the news to see a breaking story about a killer who is holding children hostage in a nursery school. The news provides the criminal's name and picture, so Light writes his name in the book. The criminal dies, and the news reports that he suddenly collapsed, but Light is still not sure if it's just a coincidence. He decides that he needs a more conclusive test. And again, Light is very methodical, trying to figure out what types of criminals would be worth going after. He figures no one too major since the cops might keep it a secret, and again, he reiterates that it can't be anyone he knows after seeing a classmate bullying another classmate at cram school. On the way home, he sees a young woman being harassed by several punks on motorcycles. One of them mentions his full name aloud, so he writes the guy's name in the Death Note, specifying the death by traffic accident. The girl runs off, the guy chasing after her on his bike, only to be hit by a truck. Light is a bit shocked by the deaths and his involvement in them. The first guy was a murderer and holding children hostage, so that's one thing, but this second guy didn't necessarily deserve to die. However, he changes his mind almost instantly, saying he thought this world was rotten, and he can use the power of the Death Note to clean up the world. He fights his fear of using the Death Note again by claiming that only someone like him has the guts to do this, only he is capable of changing the world through this. Once people notice that all the criminals in the world are dying of heart attacks, it won't take long to piece together that someone is responsible. People will be afraid to commit crimes for fear of Light's wrath, and the world will be a better place. Of course, Light will be the righteous leader of this new world. And thus, he begins to kill criminals using the Death Note, using heart attacks as the method of death in order to create this godlike persona. Once again, the anime is close, but changes just enough to have something to talk about. It keeps the timeline chronological rather than the manga that skips ahead and details back to show how Light got to writing all the names in the book in 5 days. Light does consider that if someone does die, that would make him a murderer, but shoves it off as completely impossible. It immediately cuts to the news broadcast already on, showing the criminal holding the children hostage in the nursery. After they show the man's face and name, Light writes down the name of the man in the Death Note. Just as he thinks it doesn't work, and he didn't expect it to anyway, the news reports that the suspect collapsed and is dead. Light, shaken, believes it could be a coincidence, and needs to test it again to prove its power. He says it can't be a too well-known criminal in case the death is covered up, and he wants results right away. Like the manga, he decides against killing people who he knows. The anime keeps close to the manga with the way that the punks harass the young woman while Light is on his way home. However, in the manga, we only get a few glimpses of the punks, and while they are verbally harassing the woman, they never touch her. In the anime, though, they make the assault much more apparent. Several members hold her down, while the main guy who gave his name starts to strip off her clothing with the intent of raping her. The young woman calls out for help, and we cut to Light writing down the guy's name in the book, specifying traffic accident. The events then play out as they did in the manga, with the girl running off and the punk following her on his bike, only to get hit by a truck. However, the anime doesn't include the scene of Light immediately after the second death, where he must justify the death to himself and reaffirm his belief that he is cleaning up the world. The second guy was actually doing a crime besides being an asshole, and the girl was calling out for help. Light feels more justified in this second killing, so he doesn't have that momentary inner crisis about killing an innocent person. I really wish it could have been included because it's a fascinating turning point for his personality. I think it would have been another good indication of how the Death Note warps his personality. The anime just makes him accept it without too much fanfare. Interestingly though, the 2006 live-action film changes up the first deaths a bit. Instead of the hostage situation as his first test kill, Light writes the name of a random child killer whose face and name are mentioned in the news, with no real introspection on whether or not to use it, and nothing about who he should kill. In fact, it doesn't look like he even read all the way through the various rules before writing the name down, unlike the very methodical and overcautious manga and anime versions. The next morning, Light reads the newspaper, only to see the article about the man whose name he wrote in the Death Note. We then cut to Light across the railway from the criminal he followed before finding the Death Note. The criminal recognizes Light, and he writes the guy's name in the Death Note. The guy dies of a heart attack right in front of him, confirming the Death Note's power. Without too much time to consider his actions, Ryuk reveals himself to Light and explains how he dropped the notebook. The hostage situation is used in the beginning of the film, but not explained properly until after these events occur. Here, Light is less methodical, mostly because he doesn't seem to believe that the Death Note could ever do something like that. He also has more of a personal vendetta against one of his first kills, something that manga and anime Light wanted to avoid entirely. Not that the criminal had specific connections to Light, but Light personally confronted him and knew he was really a killer. Light's kills are more sympathetic in nature compared to the manga. The first one is less of a test and more just Light taking down the name than choosing a specific person to kill. Both kills are confirmed killers and criminals, unlike the manga where the second guy probably didn't deserve to die. The movie is more subtle when it comes to Light's inner monologue, keeping it sparse in the beginning to set up more of a mystery or thriller mood. As we get more adaptations down the line, the way in which Light tests the Death Note becomes more emotionally involved and more sympathetic. The TV drama, like the 2006 movie, sets up a person for Light to kill who has some sort of personal connection to him, only even more so. This time, a bully who is threatening his best friend and who he knows has violent tendencies. Instead of a test kill and then someone he knows, this version has Light choose the bully first, again thinking the book won't work, but as soon as he writes the guy's name, he tries to erase it and it won't come off. We see as he is writing it down it's a very emotional and sudden move, and when he considers the possibility of it being real, then he tries to remove the name. Again, a less methodical and more emotional version of Light, acting on impulse and an attempt to save his friend. The next morning, a police officer comes to Light's house to deliver his cell phone to him, telling him they found it on Sakota after he died in an accident. Light overhears Sakota's friends mention how weird it was how he suddenly collapsed and then the accident occurred, making him realize the Death Note is real. He panics and hyperventilates, terrified at what he's done. His panic leaves when he overhears several people who had been bullied by Sakota who are glad he's dead, saying stuff like dying is the nicest thing he could have done. The second death is a bit of a mix. On the one hand, it is a hostage situation, but the hostage ends up being Light's father. He traded himself to save a little girl who was being held hostage, since the criminal was arrested by Light's father and holds a grudge against him. Light and his sister Sayu see the broadcast of the hostage, and after Sayu yells for someone to kill the guy to save their dad, Light runs home to use the Death Note. Light is emotional and begs for it to work, writing down the criminal's name in time to save his dad. Light does deal with the terror of killing two people, and apologizes to his father, when Ryuk shows up asking if Light feels like dying. Light is terrified and runs from Ryuk, running to a rooftop and throwing the Death Note off the roof, intending to commit suicide himself. Ryuk returns the note to him, and when Light says he doesn't want it, Ryuk goads him, telling him he can use it to do whatever he wants. To note, this is also one of the few versions where Ryuk deliberately drops the note specifically to Light, rather than by chance. It's also Ryuk who brings up the idea that someone bad could pick up the book and use it for evil. Light eventually gives in and decides to use the Death Note to rid the world of evil people. So Ryuk in this version is starting to be less neutral, and more of a physical manifestation of the temptation that the Death Note brings. He purposefully drops it near Light after witnessing the fight with Sakota, though it is ultimately Light's choice to use the notebook to kill. It is when Light tries to commit suicide for his actions that Ryuk intervenes and presents the arguments once seen as Light's inner thoughts in the previous adaptations. Light's actions, therefore, cannot be attributed to just his own drive. Light's plight is sympathetic and more of a typical story of a deal with the devil. He has good intentions from the start, and does genuinely believe he has done something bad when he kills. Ryuk, acting as the temptation of the Death Note, leads Light to the path he walks as Kira, rather than entirely Light's own choice or corruption via the Death Note's power. It's one thing if it's the influence of the Death Note bringing out Light's worst qualities, like in the manga or the anime. It's another when Ryuk blackmails Light into using it. This segues great into the Netflix version. If you thought Ryuk interfered too much in the TV drama, then wow, are you in for a treat with Willem Dafoe Ryuk. At least TV drama Ryuk waited until Light had used the Death Note before trying to force him to keep using it. Netflix Ryuk scares the crap out of Light when he's in detention and kinda tricks him into using it by saying this is a dream. Like some of the later adaptations, Light's first kill is impulsive and someone who has either hurt him or someone he's close to. In this case, it's the school bully, who not only has bullied him but has been seen harassing several other students. Light doesn't at first, but after more goading from Ryuk, he writes the bully's name down. Light also writes decapitation, probably because he doesn't believe it will work and doesn't seem like the situation could call for that. Then we get our weird Final Destination style death, and Ryuk tells Light if he doesn't want the notebook, to leave it for 7 days to pass it to the next person. Later, after Ryuk explains a few more specifics to the Death Note's rules, Light writes down the name of the man who killed his mom but got out of jail scot-free. The next day, Light hears from his dad about the death of the criminal, and Light, after seeing the happy look on his father's face, feels confident that he made the right decision. Light then goes to school, openly reading the Death Note when Mia, this film's version of Misa, sees him reading it. After talking happily about the death of the bully, eventually Light tells Mia, without too much asking on her part, about how the Death Note works and how he used it to kill the bully and his mom's murderer. To prove the Death Note is real, he looks up a live crime scene being broadcasted, a hostage situation, and kills the criminal. Mia and Light team up together to become Kira, saying they will change the world for the better by killing off those who would try to do evil. Okay, lots of stuff to unpack here in general about why this version doesn't work, but strictly speaking to how it's changed from the manga, it does have Light kill someone because he doesn't believe it's actually going to happen, but the fact that Light believes it's a dream at first does kinda take away a bit of agency in the matter. That and the fact that Ryuk points out a specific person for Light, rather than Light choosing a criminal at random. The second kill on the guy who killed his mom harkens back to a lot of the first kills being tests in previous adaptations, since it feels like Light is more in control of himself now, without Ryuk affecting him entirely. The hostage situation feels the closest to the manga's deaths, though there are still parts of it that show Light isn't as intelligent as his manga counterpart. He chooses a live broadcast in his home city, like manga Light, but makes it much more obvious that the criminal is being controlled. He does this to prove to Mia that he absolutely was responsible for the death. However, rather than a straight heart attack being something that could be explained, it ends up being a big clue for Elle to find later to piece together. Also, Light picks Mia to tell this to, someone who he knows nothing about. The only thing that they had in common was a weird love for the death of this bully. Light hardly ever acts without someone being an influence, whether it is Ryuk guiding him or him trying to show off for Mia. A lot of the deaths just feel off. Now, just because this version of Light is so radically different from the manga doesn't automatically make him bad. I kinda got the feeling they were going for a Bonnie and Clyde sort of scenario with him and Mia. However, what I don't like is just how much agency is lost on Light and how little his own actions fully contribute to the use of the Death Note. Some of the other adaptations make Light more sympathetic and emotional, but still keep a lot of the core stories similarly structured. But so much is changed and adjusted here that it makes it feel awkward. Number 3. What is the moment when Light has gone too far? Okay, some of these will be a bit subjective, as of course everyone has their own opinion on whether Light's motivations are justified, up to a variety of points. But here is the closest to what I think works as the point of no return. In this modern Faustian tale, what works with Light is seeing how far he's willing to go to achieve his goals. Early on in the manga and anime, we see that his motivations are pretty self-serving, but to a lot of people victimized by the criminals he's killed, Light's actions are seen as heroic. Light can use that as a justification for his killings, to a point. Eventually, there comes a time when it's no longer just people who are in danger, or criminals who he's killing. At some point in the story, it changes to a game of survival, of keeping himself from being caught by Elle and the police. When Lind L. Taylor proclaims himself Elle and calls out Kira for his murders, Light becomes cocky and kills him, both to show off and as a bit of a reaction to his views on justice being challenged. It's one of those times when Light's methodical nature is ignored and he acts on impulse and pride. When Elle reveals the trap he's set, Light is angered, but at the same time intrigued by the detective, and the game of each of them trying to figure out the other's identity begins. This moment is undermined slightly when we realize that Lind L. Taylor was a death row inmate. Light did intend to kill Elle, though mostly out of impulse. However, the true moment that showed Light was no longer acting for any justice but his own self-preservation was when he manages to get Ray Penber to write down all the names of the FBI agents who've been pulled in to investigate Kira. None of these people have committed crimes as we know of, and they are working for the law. Light's plan is complex and methodical, showing that he knows what he's doing. It is at this point that I felt Light was fully corrupted by the Death Note's power, and it's only a matter of time before he falls. The anime pretty much follows this aspect to a T, though there are a few minor changes in how Light acquires the information. The way he gets rid of the agents in Penber follows with the same results, with Light confident that he's not only gotten rid of the ones following him, but hopefully scaring off other potential agents. It's this moment, in addition to Naomi Misura's death, that truly cemented Light as a villain in my mind. There's really no way he can come back from this. The 2006 movie does include the death of the FBI agents, but honestly that is overshadowed by the ending. Light manages to kill Naomi Misura by sacrificing the life of his girlfriend Shiori by controlling their actions with the Death Note. This serves two purposes. It makes him look innocent, and then he's given a motivation to join the task force to meet up with L to kill him. As this is the end of the first movie of two, it helps to show the difference Light has gone through since acquiring the Death Note. We see how he has gone from someone so invested in helping others to a villain who is willing to throw away his loved ones just to save his own skin. It's why I don't mind the change to Light's character that much in this particular adaptation. It serves a narrative purpose without ruining the story or justifying all of Light's actions. Unlike the 2006 movie, which shows a decent progression of how Light becomes so corrupted, the TV drama continues again and again to make Light look super sympathetic. He needs to eliminate the agents so they won't stop Kira, and therefore the death of the criminals would stop. Light goes out of his way to try and save Misa, which ends up getting him and her caught by L as suspects of being Kira. There's always a justifiable purpose to Light's actions, a person for him to save, which is honestly not as interesting. Again, it's taking away Light's agency and giving him more of a vigilante persona. After losing his memories by giving up the Death Note, Light's personality honestly didn't really change, but now he's motivated to find Kira to save his dad. Which, well, was the purpose of using the Death Note at the beginning of the series. When he touches it again and regains his memories, suddenly he gets all cackly and more like the Light of the original manga. But it's very disjointed compared to the emotionally turmoiled character we've been following so far. It's kinda like the writers could no longer find enough justification and he just becomes evil and self-motivating. The moment then that shows that he's gone too far is when Light kills his father to save himself, but it feels a little forced for the character. The way that the memories returning moment was filmed, it kind of felt like that was supposed to be the turning point, rather than the death of Soichiro. I think it was a bit clunky, and if the writing had been a little stronger, it could have worked much better in making Light's step too far have more significance. But at the very least, he does have a moment where he really has crossed the line from potentially heroic to self-serving. And then there's the Netflix version. Light and Mia work together to write down the names of criminals, eventually gaining the notice of L and his team. L never sets up a fake person for Light to kill to prove that he can kill on the spot, and Light doesn't intend to kill the FBI agents, instead wanting to lay low and let it blow over. Mia ends up stealing the book and killing off the other FBI agents instead. Light's father ends up baiting Kira to kill him by showing his face and real name. Mia wants to kill him, but Light refuses, telling her they can't do that. If they do, they're not the good guys anymore. In a way, this is the most sympathetic version of Light, and it kinda makes the story feel flat. He's been forced into using the note, he's only tried to use it to help people, and he didn't want to kill innocent people to save himself. He even controls Watari with the Death Note, but does intend to burn the page to save his life once he gets what he wants. It's only due to Mia's interference that Watari is killed. Even at the end, every single person that Light kills off has something bad about them. Mia, of course, was willing to kill innocent people, and the randos who save him from the Ferris wheel accident all have shady pasts to let him not feel bad about killing them off and using them. The movie does everything it can to never make Light cross a line without some justification. Part of what makes A Deal with the Devil story work is when you have the character needing to make those hard choices that eventually leads to either his demise or the death of his selflessness. You can have a sympathetic start to Light work so long as the act of him falling to the dark side actually is his choice. This is one of the strongest reasons why the Netflix Light character didn't do it for me. They set up his path based on the original manga, but take away his agency, drive, and willingness to save himself no matter what. Number 4. What happens to Light in the end? The ending to the Death Note manga was one of the best endings to a story I had ever read. Light successfully killed L, but managed to get cornered by his successor, Nier. Surrounded by the task force and out of options, Light calls to Ryuk for help, his last desperate plea. Ryuk says, sure, and Light gloats to Nier, telling them how stupid they were to not kill Light immediately. Ryuk informs him, actually, no, it's Light's name he wrote down. If Light needed to rely on Ryuk's help, then that meant there was no way he was getting out of this and he's not interested anymore. After all, Ryuk did tell him in the beginning that he would be the one to write down Light's name in the notebook. Light dies, and we see pages in the Death Note say, all humans will, without exception, eventually die. After they die, the place they go to is Mu, nothingness. The manga ends a year later, with the world returning to normal crime rates and the task force continuing to work with Nier on cases every once in a while. However, there is an underground cult of worshippers who pray for Kira's return, and with that, the story ends. The story leaves it to the audience to decide if Light's actions were just, and hinting that someone else might take up the cause eventually. Light's death at the hands of Ryuk is wonderful, when he goes from feeling desperate to laughing at his enemy's stupidity to realizing his own demise. There's no more tricks left up his sleeve, and Light finally gets served the same punishment he dealt to criminals. As Ryuk says, death makes us all equal. The mostly faithful anime changes the ending slightly. While Light is cornered, he manages to get away and run, thinking back over his choices and wondering where he went wrong. Ryuk does write his name in the Death Note and he dies of a heart attack in the warehouse. The last thing he sees is the ghostly image of L. I was sad we don't get to see Light in his most vulnerable and desperate state, begging Ryuk to not kill him. The anime adds in additional imagery to add to the idea of gods and devils throughout the show, with that angelic choir music we've heard so many times being played as Light dies. The sun is setting, just as Light's life is coming to a close. While it is visually symbolic, it lacks the punch to the gut that the ending of the manga has. Seeing how far Light has fallen makes his fate all the more satisfying. He doesn't try to justify himself, he doesn't accept it with grace, he dies begging and screaming. The anime leaves that more for the audience to infer, and while pretty, I think it needed Light to actually talk to Ryuk one last time, rather than Ryuk just doing it in voiceover. We also don't see the aftermath of Light's deeds, seeing how society returns back to normal. It makes for a nice conclusion to the story, but I can see why they wanted to end with the strong image of Light's dead body seen in the light. I just wish we could have seen more complexity with the original manga ending. The 2006 anime makes a lot of changes to the ending of the story, though it still keeps the confrontation between Light and Ryuk. L wrote his own name in the Death Note, but for a longer period of time, believing Light was going to try to kill him with it. So when Light has Rem write L's name down, the first death that L provided cancels out the second Death Note. He sets up Light with a fake Death Note, and Light writes down instructions to make his father return to him and help him get free, intending to kill him too. Soichiro is fully in control though, and L is still alive. When L and Soichiro reveal the trap, Light is wounded by Matsuda and confesses that he is Kira. His ending monologue is similar to his feelings in the beginning, about the law not convicting those who would do harm, but with more of his Kira personality affecting his beliefs, saying he's a god in this world bringing salvation. Light calls for Ryuk, revealing himself. He asks for Ryuk's help, bargaining with him by promising he will show him something interesting. Write down a name, he says, and Ryuk writes down Light's name to his shock. He tells Light to remember he said he would never ask for Ryuk's direct help, and that Ryuk would be the one to kill him. Ryuk reveals that anyone who uses the Death Note doesn't go to heaven or hell, but to nothingness. Light dies, telling his father all he wanted was justice. Soichiro has to lie to his wife and daughter, saying that Kira killed Light, but they managed to stop him. He visits L in his remaining days, as he kinda became a father figure to him during the investigation. L dies, and a year later, Sayu talks with Soichiro, talking about how crimes have returned after Kira's disappearance. Sayu hates Kira since her father told her that Light was killed by him, and we see the look of sadness on Soichiro's face as he knows the truth of the situation but can never tell her. Just like the ending of the manga, we're supposed to be a bit sad at Light's death, despite everything he's done. It's a conflicting emotion. He did kill people, yes, but there was a time where he did have good intentions. Since the movie does end with the manga's ending, mostly, I don't mind the way that Light was more sympathetic in the beginning. It isn't a perfect adaptation, but it's an interesting one, because it takes pieces from the manga and changes it to see a new perspective on how Light could have been a good person if he hadn't found the Death Note. In the TV drama, although L dies, he sets up a situation for after his death in capturing Light with help from Nier and the task force. Nier shows a video L left before his death, confronting Light about being Kira and his plan to stop him. Surrounded and without allies with him, Light calmly tries to explain his reasoning and make the others see that his form of justice is helping to rid the world of evil. However, as Nier challenges him, Light becomes more emotional and erratic, saying only he was capable of creating this path for the sake of others, asking what Nier would have done had he gotten the Death Note. We see Light explain that he killed the hostage who would have killed his dad, acting to save someone he loved. However, when confronted on then how he killed his own father, he says, "Because he was in my way." His form of justice needed to continue on, even if it meant killing his own father. He tries writing down names in the Death Note before being shot by Matsuda, and Mikami knocks over some oil barrels and lights it on fire in an attempt to save Light. Everyone else escapes while Light is trapped inside, severely injured. He tries to reach the Death Note before it burns up, begging and screaming that it can't end this way. He mentions that if he dies here, his father's death is meaningless. He grabs the still on fire note and asks Ryuk to trade for the Shinigami eyes, whatever it takes. However, Light is set on fire and Ryuk tells him it's too late, and Light dies. The series ends with Nier being shown a second video L recorded, but it's opposite to the one seen before. L apologizing to Light for believing he is Kira and saying he is suited to becoming a detective who could work with Nier. Even though it was highly unlikely, he recorded it just to be safe, but also because a part of him really did want Light to be innocent. The series ends with a shot of L's grave and Nier walking away from it. The moon can be seen in the sky, as a possible allusion to Light since the kanji for his name is moon. So we are seeing the way in which Light has been corrupted by the power of the Death Note in the end, even contradicting himself when it comes to why he used the note to save his father originally, only to kill him later for his own self-preservation. We also see Light at his most desperate, crawling towards the burning Death Note, saying he cannot die or everything he has done will be meaningless. Although Ryuk doesn't write down Light's name, Light sort of still asks for help. However, it's less of a comeuppance for Light's last-minute desperation, and more just that there was no way he was getting out of this situation alive. He's bleeding out, on fire, and the Death Note is burning. Ryuk knows his time is up. Whereas manga Ryuk knows that Light still has years left, but if he is in jail, he won't do anything interesting and he cuts it off now before having to wait around for Light to die. It has some elements from the manga in it, but still is changed enough where it does affect some of the story. We do see this version as very tragic, as he didn't want to use the Death Note at first, but was goaded into it by Ryuk's logic rather than his own. His transformation into this psychopath was also really sudden and didn't make as much sense dramatically, since he really only becomes the psychopath after regaining his memories and he becomes more concerned about self-preservation. This version is definitely touching upon Light as a tragic figure more than a lot of the others, like a Greek tragedy. You see it in his utter confusion and lack of understanding when the task force doesn't agree with his views of justice. It is destroying him as he has become consumed by the Death Note's hold. This version shifts the balance a bit more in Light's favor, to at least feeling sorry for his death, rather than the it can go either way vibe that I get from other adaptations. And then there's the Netflix version. Light is blackmailed by Mia, who has stolen the Death Note and written Light's name in it. To save himself and stop her, he sets up a complicated plan. After falling from a Ferris wheel, he is rescued by a doctor who puts him in a medically induced coma. A criminal finds the Death Note and uses it to commit crimes until 2 days later returning it to Light. He manages to get the page his name is on burned in the fall, saving his life through the weird Final Destination rules that work in this version. The doctor, the criminal, and Mia were all manipulated by Light's convoluted plan, all dying in the process. Light's dad manages to figure out that Light is Kira, and when he confronts him about it, Light admits he's made mistakes. He wanted to kill just the bad guys, but it got more complicated than that. Meanwhile, Elle manages to find pages of the Death Note in Light's room and considers writing Light's name in it. Light says he was choosing the lesser of two evils. Light sees Ryuk cackling, and who says, "Humans are so interesting," ending the film. They left it kind of open-ended since they probably wanted to have a sequel, which is why there isn't really a conclusive ending with either L or Ryuk writing a name down. The lesson that Light learns at the end is that sometimes you have to make hard choices for survival, like killing Mia. He's not really showing much remorse for his choices though, since he honestly believes he's done good. Light's character change is mostly due to Mia. She is the one who set the serious consequences in motion by killing the FBI agents and threatening to kill Light's dad. This version of Light refuses to kill his father, the biggest change from all the previous adaptations. It's still kind of early in the story, so it makes sense that it wouldn't happen right away. However, if there is a sequel happening, I'm curious to see what Light's relationship with him is going forward. He's admitted to his father that he's Kira. Will he then need to silence his father to keep his secret? Judging by just what we have here though, Light really hasn't fallen to the dark side enough for his death to be a satisfactory ending, so it's no real surprise he wasn't killed off in this first movie. We haven't even really seen Light do that much to be considered evil for the sake of self-preservation. He kills off Mia because he's afraid of what she will do with the note once she is the owner, and we've seen before she is willing to sacrifice anyone, so his wanting to stop her could be justified. He forces criminals to do his dirty work at the end. This feels more like what the deaths of the FBI agents was in the manga. Light isn't particularly devious here. He isn't killing completely innocent people. He's still doing what he feels is justified sacrifice. He also confesses to his father, something the previous Lights would never have done unless under extreme situations. The arc that Light is supposed to go through in this version just doesn't flow the same way as the others, which is why it's so bad as an adaptation. I'm aware this is supposed to be kind of a new take on Light, but just by the order of these 4 events of his setup, first couple of murders, the worst crimes, and the ending, it just falls flat. Conclusion. There's a lot to like in these adaptations, and it makes sense as to why they make changes to the story. If it was completely the same, then really it's no different from the manga. It's one thing for the anime to stick so close, but for the movies, yeah, I can see why they changed some stuff. The anime is the most faithful in general, though I think some of the setup and the ending should have stuck to the original book, rather than using a lot of biblical imagery and audio. But in terms of sticking closest to the source material, it wins by a long shot. If nothing else, because it was allowed to have the most time and ease of working with the material. For the live-action versions, what they changed about the story has to make sense for the adaptation they are going with. After the anime, I'd say the 2006 movie is the closest in terms of adapting the most significant moments in the series. And yes, it changes quite a bit in the middle, but I forgive a lot of it since it's only 2 movies trying to cover quite a number of manga chapters. Light in the 2006 version is made more sympathetic in the beginning in order to show the progression of the Death Note's influence. By the end of the first movie, he's willing to sacrifice his loved ones. That is an interesting take compared to the anime and manga, which didn't really give much time to setting up Light's behavior before receiving the Death Note. The movie doesn't excuse Light's behavior, and as a result of his hubris, he's killed by Ryuk. The consequences of the manga's original ending still works in context with the changes made by the movie to Light's beginnings. The TV drama falters a bit with this, because like the 2006 movie, we see a sympathetic start to Light, but it takes a really long time for him to become the monster Kira. It presents an interesting idea by having him willing to throw the note away and die in the beginning, when he is still sorry for his actions despite the good he's done. However, his memories returning was handled incredibly poorly, and he just switches on a dime. It doesn't have a natural feel to it and kinda suffers as a result. It does still go through a lot of the major moments mentioned, but due to the large amount of sympathy towards Light's motivations, as well as Ryuk's more direct involvement in keeping the note, it ends up affecting each subsequent moment down the line. For an example, it's kind of like what they did with Shay from Game of Thrones. Book Shay is conniving, and we aren't really surprised when she betrays Tyrion. But Show Shay is made much more complex and emotional, and truly does love Tyrion. So when the show suddenly forces her back on her book path to betray Tyrion, it doesn't gel well. Light still chooses to kill his father, which is the point in which his death felt inevitable to me. However, some of his actions and motivations dictated by the manga's story are a little more disjointed compared to the 2006 films. And then there's the Netflix version. It sort of serves as the culmination of how the adaptations over the years begin to add more and more stuff to an already strong story. Light is super sympathetic and doesn't want to kill innocent people, and doesn't really have a moment where he needs to make a hard choice. Ryuk's role as a devil on the shoulder is much like the TV drama in how little agency Light has. Ryuk needs to be a neutral party in this situation for it to work. You can't blame Light's decisions entirely on his own, due to both Ryuk and Mia. Light was stupid enough to immediately blab to a girl he barely knows about his super awesome death book, so you kinda don't feel too bad for most of the stuff happening to him. He isn't making a Faustian deal. It's a lot more pressured and pushed onto him becoming Kira. He fights Mia on the idea of self-preservation, sticking to his guns even at the very end. For this story to work, you need Light to go through an arc, and he doesn't really change at all. Even with all the goading from Ryuk in the TV drama, Light does change, albeit abruptly. Basically, the Netflix version suffers from being the bad ending to some of the choices made by previous adaptations. Make Light sympathetic at the start. This makes him less interesting. Have him use the note on a person he knows. It's less of a hard choice for him to make. Have Ryuk force him into using the note. He eventually gets a taste for power and suffers for it as a result. Light doesn't beg for help from Ryuk. We never see him at a low point. He never trusts Ryuk at all and therefore won't do that. So yeah, even the most faithful adaptations of Death Note still make changes here and there that changed how I viewed the story. The anime gets it so close, but makes a bit of a misstep at the very end. The 2006 version gave me a more sympathetic Light, and it was a refreshing take on it, since I lent more to L than Light when I first read the story. The TV drama tries to have each character face tough questions, like L not being 100% sure about Light being Kira due to their friendship. And even the Netflix version had some merit. The Death Note story, on paper, can work in an American setting. However, due to how much they changed the events and the personalities in the story, it's presented as more of a what-if scenario than a full proper adaptation. What if Misa had acquired the Death Note first, then Light? Light is given the dead parents' backstory Misa had. He's more emotional and stupid at times, and isn't willing to do everything it takes to keep his identity as Kira safe. Mia instead is more willing to kill innocent people to keep using the note, and once Light shows her how it works, she weasels her way into his life by using her romantic wiles. When you look at it more that way, it feels less frustrating, but inevitably, if you've seen any previous versions before, of course comparisons are gonna happen. I applaud the Netflix version for trying to be a really different take on the story, but due to just how much they change or didn't change in some plot cases, it really could have benefited if it had just been an original story, or possibly a future after the events of the first Death Note story. That could work for a movie, right? Right? Okay, maybe not. So, what did you guys think about these various versions of Death Note? Which felt like the strongest live-action adaptation to you, and kept true to the themes and feel of the manga? Also, which Light was your favorite? For me, I adore Tatsuya Fujiwara's performance, and not just because he was also in Battle Royale. Post your thoughts and comments below, since, as we know, these will help to stave off the inevitable presence of the YouTube algorithm. And, if you're feeling generous, please hit that like button or subscribe if you haven't already. This was a Patreon requested review, so if you'd like to request a future episode, feel free to head over to my Patreon page and become a patron today. Links to that, along with all my other social media, are down below. Thank you all so much, and I look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Bye! Hey everyone! As this is a Patreon-sponsored episode, I wanted to take this opportunity to give a quick reminder about how Patreon works. It's a website that allows you to pledge a certain amount of money per month to your favorite content creators, allowing us to actually make a career out of this. Depending on how much you pledge, you get a variety of rewards in exchange. Some of my rewards for you include having your name in the credits, joining my Discord chat room, and getting early access to my videos. Or, at the highest tier, you can even choose something for me to review, such as with this episode. Every little bit counts, so even if you can only do $1, that really builds up over time and helps me to make this show even better. Thanks for your support, and I'll see you in the next video. and more of a physical...
There's the script.
It does have... And he didn't want to kill innocent people to save him.
There's the script. Bye-bye.